And it's sort of a compendium of Hasidic teachings
Yeah.
that span the early to mid 1700s all the way into the 20th century. And
Sounds
so
wonderful.
it's usually a couple of little pieces, and then having a study partner is a really, I mean, I
Yeah.
find that a really great way to delve into how this reads on our personal lives. So,
Yeah. I've got to turn this off. Somebody's trying to reach me, and I've got to put that off to the side for a minute. So looks like we have some additional people who have joined us.
Yeah.
There was Nancy and Judith and Wynn.
And if you want to see everyone in a big square, there in the upper right corner, there's something that's called gallery view.
Right.
And if you click on that, then you'll see squares. I should have a mirror, and then I could hold up the mirror and you could see what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
Also, I'm recording, and the recording is just for people who are signed up for the group.
Okay.
And also, I have someone disbanded from the group, and they had a really interesting reason why, and I thought it would be a great thing that you might want to talk about. And
Okay.
they said, I'm not interested in self-development. I'm going to use my own words. I'm interested in saving the world.
Okay. And these are in conflict how?
This
That's
person
the question.
seemed to think they were in conflict, that he wanted to put his energy toward the world rather than toward themselves.
But I think my question remains. I mean,
Unfortunately,
okay,
they're not here.
Well, I know that.
But it was kind of
title, you know.
The inference I got was this was very self-centered activity to build character, like a self-improvement process.
Isn't making yourself a better person part of improving the world or saving the world?
Judith, it's not fair to be logical. You can't do that.
Oh, okay.
That's against the rules. No, of course, you know, it's so interesting when people come from this point of view, as if these are somehow in conflict or in contradiction of each other. I don't know. You know, one of the things that people will ask me sometimes is why I have this website, everybodyneedsarabbi.com. What is the point of that? And, you know, from one point of view, it's, you know, it's to learn about Judaism and spiritual and theological elements of Judaism. But for me, it's tikkun olam. I mean, the idea is some things that we have in the Jewish tradition would be beneficial to the world in general and make a positive difference to the world in general if we could somehow translate them outside of our own little bailiwick into the larger public domain. So to me, and it's just me, I recognize, but to me, the distinction, the boundary between the two gets very, very fuzzy. And I think that is not by accident, but that's just me.
I'm going to send this recording to him so he can hear some of this.
Okay, so we are still missing some folks, but I think we will start anyway, if that's okay with everybody. I don't want to lose too much time. All right, so one way to approach this at this early stage of our study is to start out by understanding what are the main activities that one might engage in pursuing a program of Mussar. Now, and I say of Mussar because, you know, I don't want to confuse the issue by saying spirituality, because for some people that means, you know, quartz crystals and things of that sort, you know, which is certainly not what I have in mind. It's not what the Jewish tradition has in mind, but to some people, that's what it is. For others, spirituality means something very personal. Sometimes it excludes other elements of what Judaism is about. So I'm going to just leave all that stuff to the side with your kind permission and say that I want to start with this term of Mussar. And the reason, and the philosophical background for this is a philosophical school that developed in the 20th century, kind of a phenomenological approach. The idea is like this. If you start out by saying, this is what X means, whatever the term is, we've already sort of decided what the outcome is, and it becomes very confusing. The way you decide what something means is to see how the term operates as it is used in philosophical discourse or in study and so on and so forth. So if we want to find out what Torah is, we don't start out with some sort of definition we get from the dictionary. We see how the word Torah functions. And that gives us a clue as to what the term actually means. So it's a kind of inductive approach. The idea for us is to say, okay, we're not going to start out by saying, what is Mussar? And here's our short-term or our long-term definition of what the word means. Because when we do that, we've already set its boundaries, and those boundaries are not something that maybe we're imposing on the term. I don't want to do that. I want to start to see, okay, how do we use it? What are the functionalities that are involved? And from that, each as individuals or as a group, we will draw some conclusions, which is fine. And we may not draw any conclusions at all. We may just be most comfortable with saying Mussar is Mussar, and that's the way it is. All right, so we're going to put the traditional definition aside for the moment, and we're going to recognize that there is a definition of the word Mussar, which means instruction or something along those lines. Again, there's not unanimity of opinion about how to translate the term, but we can start off with the idea that there is a process to do Mussar. There's a process of enacting Mussar, apart from any verbal definition we might give it. And we start out with the idea that there are qualities or midot, characteristics, if you prefer, that are identified as being essential to what Mussar is involved with and how we engage in the activity of Mussar. Depending on who you talk to, the conventional number of such midot is 48. Now, why are there 48? Because they're not 47, they're not 49, they're 48. And if you ask me why 48, I can give you some sort of fancy sermonic definition, but that's all that it would be. So let's start out with some of these qualities of the midot that you probably already know. If I were to ask you the question, what are the important things to know about? What are the important activities to engage in order to become the kind of person, and through your own activity to help in the creation of the kind of world, the kind of society that would be ideal or would be desirable? What are some of those qualities? Any suggestions?
Compassion.
Compassion is a good one, yeah. What do you have in mind when you say that, Michael?
An awareness of the individuality of another person and the way in which they are interacting with the world around them.
Okay, a good starting point. I want to emphasize that although we are inclined to look at things exactly in that way, to say that the quality has to do with how we see other people or how other people function, the truth is that on another level, these qualities apply to ourselves as much as they do to other people. We're not dealing only with how we see others or how we understand others to act in the world, but how we ourselves are actors in the world.
Yeah.
And one of the ways in which to understand any of the midot, any of the characteristics, is that every midah, every quality or every trait or every characteristic that we can name, and compassion is a big one, there's no question, includes within it its own undoing. I'll use that term. And that is to say, compassion includes the idea of making judgments, even negative judgments. It's you can't only be compassionate. Compassion includes the ways in which we don't enact it, even though we might want to. So as people who want to pursue this midah, this characteristic, it is crucial that we understand that working to acquire or to deepen this quality also means to inquire into the way in which its opposite, if you like, operates in our lives.
So it's kind of a continuum, in a sense.
Well, in a way, it's a continuum, Kim. In a way, we might be better served by looking at it not so much as a continuum, but as the quality implies its opposite or its negative image. You know, I come from a literary background, and you have this notion of what's called negative capability or negative qualifications. So if you have a certain quality or certain aspect, its opposite is implied, and it is carried by the term itself.
So I'm looking at a homeless man on the street, and one part of me might say, why doesn't he get a job? Why doesn't he get off the corner? And then the other extreme was, what's been happening in his life to get him where he is?
Yes.
And what might I do to, alleviate some of this?
And the important thing to bear in mind as a kind of amplification of that point, Kim, is that the negative you, that is to say, why don't you get a job or whatever it is, the implied criticism or expressed criticism is already included in the characteristic or in the trait that we are talking about. So it's not as if it is in contradistinction to those things. It is a part of the very idea. I saw a hand from Judith.
And Michael too, yeah.
Oh, okay, we'll get to Michael after Judith.
Judith, go ahead. Judith.
Oh, okay. I was thinking that a negative aspect of compassion might be enabling. I'll do everything for you. I'll take care of you. And the person never learns how to take care of himself or herself.
That's a very good point. And just to make sure that it's clear, the idea of enabling is already contained within the idea of compassion. It is a kind of compassion. It may not be the best form of compassion, depending upon how we view these things. And I'm not sure I should even say best form, but it is already implied by the idea of compassion. It is not something apart from it. It is not something that is imposed on it. It is a kind of compassionate expression. So yeah, I mean, I take your suggestion very, very, very kindly. And what I'm saying is that in the context of understanding what a characteristic is, these problematic expressions of the characteristic are already operating. Okay, yeah, Michael, what did you want to add?
So I just was curious whether or not this negative characteristic is a midah in and of itself, or are the midot only supposed to be the positive carrying along the negative?
That is a very good question. And my own answer is to say that the midah includes both of these aspects. It is not just the positive, or for that matter, just the negative. The idea of compassion contains within it a number of different possibilities. And the contemplation, the exploration, the examination of those possibilities is exactly what the endeavor of Mussar is.
Mm.
It's why we engage in chevruta, in study with a partner, because the role that the partner plays is to precisely act as a foil along these lines, and to point out dimensions of our investigation that perhaps we are blind to, or that we don't see clearly, or we don't put enough emphasis on. But it's not just that. It is to say that to understand what it means, let's say, to use your example, Michael, to understand what compassion is, requires us to investigate all sorts of different ways in which the term or the name of the midah points to something that functions in our lives. Mm. It is not an idea that exists apart from the way things are, the way we act, the way in which we engage with the world around us, and that includes with ourselves. So, for example, engaging with another person in paired study is one way, but one of the classic ways of engaging in the Mussar activity is through journaling. Mm-hmm. So we get involved as a matter of discipline with the daily activity of writing in a journal. And the idea of writing in the journal is not to explore some theoretical or philosophical idea that we're going to explore on a very high level. That's what we usually do in order to avoid things. From a Mussar point of view, it is to look at the very practical ways in which, very down-to-earth ways in which the various qualities, or various aspects of that particular midah, that particular characteristic, are embedded in what we do and what others do around us. It's not to say what does compassion mean in a theoretical sort of way, but if we engage in, I don't know, saying hi to the postal delivery carrier in the morning, that can be a manifestation or not of compassion. There are all sorts of elements. You're in the checkout line. This is a big one for me. Waiting on somebody who has to write out a check drives me nuts. But looking at this, one of the midot is savlanut, of patience. That is a big thing for me to think about and to investigate. What the enterprise is looking at these very down-to-earth examples which give expression to the characteristic. We're not going to necessarily just talk about the characteristic in a theoretical way, but how do we behave in such a way that either gives expression to or does not give expression to this particular characteristic, whatever it happens to be. And just in case you were worried about whether or not you had enough to do, there are 48, according to the classic sources, 48 of these midot. all of which have different aspects. We can all be involved in the exploration of these midot for a very long time. And that's part of the endeavor of trying to incorporate Mussar in our lives, of following this spiritual discipline. We are typically, and I'm going to step outside the role of leading a discussion about Mussar to speak about study in a general sort of way. There are people who want to say, okay, what does this concept of Mussar really mean? What is the philosophical, the theoretical description that's being referred to? Which is a very nice shortcut way of dealing with the issue, but which doesn't lead to the actual enterprise of doing Mussar. Okay, we can all come up with a definition of what patience means, or what any of the other midot might happen to be. Knowing what the definition might be doesn't necessarily get us any closer to understanding what that midah or that characteristic is in a real and practical and spiritual sense. Jewish spirituality is not about theory. It is about behavior, as Judaism in general is about behavior. It is about acting in a way that is informed by the characteristics that we're referring to.
So in the example that I came up with, it's not so much defining what compassion is, but is my behavior compassionate behavior? And if not, it's worth exploring what behavior does come up in that particular circumstance.
Exactly. That is exactly, you hit the nail on the head, Michael. I mean, the point is, where do you find this discussion located? You can locate it on a theoretical level, on a philosophical level, but that doesn't get you really very far. Where you find it, as it were, in a granular sort of way, is in actual small examples of behavior. Those are the things that we start with in understanding how these characteristics operate in our lives, not on the grand scale, but on the everyday scale.
Mm-hmm.
How is it that things that we do or things that people around us do are evidence or not evidence of this particular characteristic? How do we discover that? How do we come to grips with that? And the way we do it, according to most of the sources that I'm familiar with, is to say, okay, what if I was going to take very seriously what it means to give evidence to a particular quality, whatever it might happen to be? Today, I'm talking for me about patience, but it could be compassion, it could be learning, it could be all sorts of things. Where am I going to find that? What is the starting off point? Where do I locate that in a real and operational sort of way? And the answer that I find is not on the level of theory,
mm-hmm.
or on the grand philosophical level, but on the very down-to-earth level. If I want to know what it means to have compassion, it begins with the idea, perhaps, depending on how you look at it, it begins with the idea that in interacting with other people, and in considering our own actions, there are ways in which we do not act with compassion. And we discover that by looking at the everyday behavior that we give expression to. So compassion means, for example, withholding judgment, even in very small sorts of ways. It means exercising judgment in ways that are helpful and deepen our lives. It doesn't mean doing without judgment at all, but in understanding what are the ways in which judgment is a part of compassion. So we don't do away with the idea altogether, but we recognize that there is fine tuning that is required in order to for compassion to actually function in our lives. Yes, go ahead.
So there's, I was just thinking about this look at compassion in ourselves.
Okay.
Not necessarily compassion for ourselves or compassion for someone else, but it seems to me that there's a value not in looking at whether someone else is being compassionate, but in looking at ourselves at whether our behavior is compassionate.
I think that is right on the money, and the one way of expressing that from my point of view is to recognize that how we view the way compassion operates in other people's lives is a way of talking about how it operates in our own lives, and vice versa. If you cannot understand how we see other people's behavior unless we look carefully at our own behavior. So whether it's this one particular characteristic or some other, our own behavior and the behavior of others are implied one by the other. You can't look at what other people are doing apart from looking at what you yourself are doing and the other way around. So it would be interesting and easier to simply say, well, okay, we can look at this process as saying understanding compassion is about looking at what other people do. Are they acting compassionately? Well, that is true.
But we have to be careful about that.
Yes. And here, what I'm trying to get at, Michael, and I don't know if I'm being clear or expressing this clearly, being careful about that means, in my view, not just not making a judgment about other people, but understanding the reflexive nature of the midah, of the characteristic. So when we are speaking about whatever the midah happens to be, whatever the characteristic happens to be, we are by definition talking about ourselves. That's what makes it a useful concept. That's what makes it an experience that leads to what? To growth, towards understanding, et cetera, down the line. If all that our understanding of a characteristic was, let us understand somebody else, it would have very limited use for us. Not that it would have no use, but limited use. The real use of understanding any characteristic is the way that it operates in our own lives, and that includes not only what other people do and has an impact on us, but on what we ourselves do, and that is a complicated matter. So, we can look at the list of midot and say, okay, so what are some of the qualities that we're looking at here? Because we're talking about compassion, which is a very important one, and we've been talking a little bit also about patience. But
Do you want me to bring up the list?
well, we could bring up the list, and I was just to do that. Yeah, that would be fine.
Okay.
And I wanted to take a look at this because there are all sorts of characteristics here that maybe we would have in mind and maybe we wouldn't. So, for example, here are just a few. Let's start with the idea that each characteristic includes its undoing within itself. So you see this list of patience includes impatience, generosity includes stinginess, gratitude includes deprivation, trust includes worry or fear, honor includes judgment, enthusiasm includes laziness. These analogs are part of the characteristic in and of themselves. They're not something imposed on it. There's not something alien in it, but it's part of the very concept. Part of what we will be doing is looking at how this operates. But look at the list of qualities that we could point to. Let's say, for example, here's a good one.
People can see it now, can't they?
Well, I don't know what they see.
Yeah.
There's a list that's on my screen. I don't know if it's the same as
Okay.
everybody's.
Yes, it's the same on everybody's.
Okay. So we have patience or savlanut. The word itself, Hebraically, means to bear a burden. How is that a part of this notion of patience? If you are acting out of patience, it involves bearing the burden. What is the burden?
Well, it's to me, a part of the burden is giving up this immediate desire we have to react.
Okay, that's the start. What is it that gets in the way of being patient?
Impatience.
I'm sorry?
Impatience.
Well, yes, true. I cannot argue with that. You're right. But what constitutes impatience? What are the kinds of things that we might experience as undercutting our ability to be patient?
How about waiting in line?
What is there about waiting in line, Judith, that might?
We want to be there. We want to get it done.
Yeah.
And
okay.
other people are in our way.
Yeah, people are in our way. People block us. We have maybe even a positive idea of what our goal is, and we are thwarted. We are blocked from achieving that. And that may be what leads to our not being able to be patient.
There's another part to it that I've been thinking about recently, which is that the current circumstance is unsatisfactory.
Yes.
And the next moment will give us freedom. So we have to rush to it.
Yes. Very, very good. That's right on the money, because our impatience has to do with the fact, not that it's not a negative, it is that there is some positive outcome, maybe even that we desire and which would be important to achieve or to accomplish or to reach. It doesn't necessarily have to be something negative or nefarious. Maybe to look at it from a quasi-mystical point of view, we want to reach the messianic era, and we are impatient with the fact that we seem to be far away from it, and we are exasperated perhaps by a number of different factors in life, personally and otherwise, which seem to frustrate our accomplishment or our achievement of this goal. There's nothing wrong with the goal. There's not even anything wrong necessarily with our eagerness to reach it. But it can be a problem, especially if it gets in our way of having a basic behavior, which we would call being patient. If it gets in the way of being patient with another person or with ourselves, then that goal is operating in a way that we have to be careful about. So at the same time that we look at the desirability of being patient, we are also recognizing that it is the very laudable goals that we have which can sometimes militate against being patient. This is one of those things that, you know, from the standpoint of rabbinic thought, you know, to me, this is sort of a basic sort of thing, but I think we often ignore it. We often put it to the side as if somehow it's a separate kind of entity. And in fact, it's not. It is already embedded in the very idea of the characteristic that we are in favor of enacting. Am I being clear when I say that?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah, I like to ask something.
Yes, please, Kim.
Well, something I've been involved in is trying to feel these things in my body.
Okay.
And that the enacting is not just a mind thing, but I'm trying to feel like when I'm feeling compassion, how that feels in my body and where it's occurring, as opposed to something like sympathetic joy or loving kindness. And I feel that they're different bodily functions almost. There's a different set of chemistry that's running through my body with each one.
That is a very interesting point. Say a little bit more about that.
Well, like worry. So all of a sudden I'm feeling something right here.
Okay. Maybe
just when I say that word worry or love, I'm feeling love, you know, and each one of these words trying to pay attention to where it is in my body. These are not just thoughts.
That's true. They are not just thoughts.
You know, I've noticed since I'm an artist, I've noticed, like, I go to an art museum and each painting actually affects my body and I feel it in a different place. Or if you said the name of a person, like my wife or my daughter or something, each one, you know, you could kind of locate. It does something different to you. And physiologically.
Yes, it does. And to broaden the idea just a tad, this applies both in a positive and in a negative way. It's not just that, okay, if I say Linda to you, Kim, that brings about certain kinds of feelings or certain kinds of attitudes on your part. Yes. But if I were to say, I don't know, Hitler or George Wallace or whatever, I mean, there would be something, it's a very different kind of feeling, but equally visceral feeling in your body. If I were to refer to those people as well. So we're not talking only about things that are desirable, we're also talking about things that are not so desirable. And the negative as well as the positive are part of the reaction that we have as human beings to a whole variety of different qualities or behaviors or responses. And the interesting part of this is something that I work on a lot with mixed success, is to try to identify the emotions that I am encountering. And to do that requires me to locate them in my body. That is very hard for me to do, and I think it's very hard for a good number of people to do, because we are trained, for better or worse, to separate the body and emotions, one from the other. The idea that somehow the body and the soul, or the body and the self, are distinct and separable entities is an idea that we operate with in philosophy in general, in the West and in the East. But the goal, at least from a Jewish point of view, is to identify that it is impossible to separate these two, one from the other. That the emotions and the body and so on and so forth are inextricably bound up one in the other, and that part of what our job is as human beings is to reconnect the body and the emotions, or the body and the self, if you prefer, or soul, if you want to use theological language, and to overcome this idea of these being separate domains. This is one of the special features of Judaism. It's not unique. I mean, there are other traditions that have similar ideas, but it is a special feature of spiritual life in Judaism. And part of what we're dealing with Mussar, is the attempt through a variety of different modalities to reconnect all of that. Not to say that there isn't some special value to operating in a world in which they are distinct. This is the epistemological stance of Martin Buber, and I don't want to get too far afield here, but the idea of the I thou and the idea of the I it exactly reflect this distinction. Buber's position, and it's my position as well because I follow Buber in this, Buber's position is not that one modality has value and the other does not or has less value, but they are different ways of knowing. They have different epistemological, if you want to use that term, qualities. So there is value to the analysis in the world of I-it. It doesn't displace the way we know things in a more holistic sort of sense in the world of I-thou. And similarly, the holistic or the broad apperception of what goes on does not replace the world of I-it. And they are separate but related domains. If we walk into the post office, is my go-to example, and we want to buy a stamp because we are out of stamps. It is not our goal necessarily to have an I-thou relationship with the postal clerk. And it's okay that if we don't. The value of that interaction may just be, there is an analytical position here. I have a need, you have an entity, and we have an exchange, and we meet each other's needs in that limited sort of way. That has value, but it is not all that there is. And of course, the end of that spectrum is something that a lot of people find very problematic in Buber, which is Buber claims you can have an I-thou relationship with an animal. How is that even possible? I don't know. But he thinks so, and there's some reason to think that he may be right about that.
You don't have any cats?
No, cats don't qualify in my worldview.
Wait a minute, they're not animals? Oh, dogs. Okay.
Yeah, that is. I'm sure there are people who feel about cats the way I feel about dogs. The example that Buber uses is a horse.
Uh-huh.
Because there is a sense in which we interact with some of these animals in ways that go beyond what we normally would attribute to them.
I'm just curious about Buber.
In fact, a friend of mine who raised horses, she and I had a long conversation one time, And her description of her relationship with the horses made a profound change in my life in seeing that possibility. And by the
Yeah.
way, I totally disagree with you about the postal clerk.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yes.
What is your disagreement?
The recognition of that person's humanity
Yes.
and dealing with them from that perspective
Uh-huh.
makes it an I-thou relationship.
You and I have to have a discussion about what an I-thou relationship is. I
Okay.
understand what you're saying, but I'm not suggesting that having some sort of significant relationship is the same as having an I-thou relationship. But we can talk about that, Michael. And
That's one of the problems
Okay.
of our wearing masks, or of my wearing a mask, and I do when I go out. I'm a smiler, and nobody can see my smile. I guess I'm going to get crinkles around my eyes, and that'll show.
well, in
It's
part,
tough
we'll
for-
start reading other features of the affect that we demonstrate, but there is some loss. I mean, look, when we go online for this class, it's not as if there is no value to that. There's plenty of value, but there are things that are hidden that simply are not visible in the world of online learning, which is not to say that they aren't there. They're just, not visible. But that's not different from life in general, is it? I mean, even if we have greater levels of disclosure, greater levels of information, we're not wearing a mask or whatever, at least not a physical mask, that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't things that are hidden from our view. There still are. It would be nice if that were not the case, I suppose, but I don't, in the end, think that that's a possibility, but that's just me. All right, so having said all that, what I want to move on to is to this idea that what we are involved with in dealing with Mussar, in dealing with spiritual life from a Jewish point of view, is on one level the actuality day-to-day of how spiritual life is expressed, how it is encountered, and so on. It is also on a very, very concrete, if I can say it this way, level, the ways in which it is, the spiritual life is not a straight line. It is about contradictory or conflicting realities. The idea is that what we find has spiritual meaning includes those things we might want to avoid or we might want to diminish in some way, but that these ideas are included already. But there's another dimension to it. There's the dimension of discipline. And this is where I think that we have a special sort of responsibility. And it is that to understand spiritual life from a Jewish point of view is not to understand or even to embrace a certain range of concepts. We can do that, but that's not the same as spiritual life. Spiritual life has to do, from as I understand it, with the ways in which we enact the values or the characteristics or the traits called midot in Mussar's sources, and this enacting is where the actual spiritual value is found. The idea is not where the value is. The value is found most readily in the attempt to live the value And not just to live it in the sense that, okay, I have this principle, I'm going to try to act in accordance with the principle, but it is to look at what we actually do in minute, careful, detailed sorts of ways, in ways that might go beyond what we would normally think of as being relevant from a philosophical point of view. So maybe in talking about, if we're going to talk about patience, that might mean having to do with something to do with standing in line at the grocery store. It might have something to do with understanding how we make judgments about what happens in our lives or what other people do. It may also have something to do with how we view ourselves, what sort of attitude or what sort of emotion comes along with what we ourselves do in our interaction, not only with others, but in understanding ourselves. All of these come into play. And for that reason, it's as Kim was reminding us, we can't fully separate what happens in ourselves with what happens in our world. The fact that these two ultimately are impossible to actually distinguish fully one from the other is the basic reality that we start off with. That seems like maybe a very simple statement, but it's not so simple, because trying to do that, as opposed to trying to understand that, are two different, if I can use the metaphor, two different kettles of fish. To act out of that understanding is different than to understand what that concept means.
I think Michael wanted to
so-
say something.
Yeah, Michael, I'm sorry. I'm not
okay.
seeing everybody's faces.
That's all right. That's all right. So in one sense, the midot don't matter, because what matters is our behavior.
Uh-huh.
And the midot, and with the numbers of them and the understanding of them, or the using them as a means of exploring and understanding ourselves, so that somehow there's this magic gap that occurs between the studying of them and using them to examine ourselves and the way in which we behave in the world, not in a self-conscious kind of way, but in a more spontaneous way.
I think that there's a lot in that I would agree with. But I want to add a related concern, Michael. I think what I would want to point towards is that the midot matter, but they matter in a way that perhaps is different than we would normally think. It's not the concept, the philosophical concept, or the conceptual concept of a particular midah that is what's important. It is the way in which it is a tool that is important. If we were to pick a midah, whatever the midah happens to be, from number 1 to number 48, any one of those can be the key or the tool that unlocks the way in which we encounter what is meaningful and what is not meaningful in the world in general, and what is meaningful and not meaningful in our lives. It is to say that with the value of the midot is we are forced to come to grips with what the heck does it mean to espouse the value of patience, or of generosity, or of truth, or whatever it may happen to be that we are looking at. How do we contend with, how do we make sense of such ideas? If we look at it from that point of view, the value of any particular midah is that it forces us to be specific, to be granular about what it is that we are looking for, what it is that would be a meaningful expression of these characteristics. Would they necessarily have a broader applicability? They might, yes. But that's not where you start. Where you start is on the level of the very basic encounter. So from the standpoint of the point you were just making, Michael, I wouldn't say that the midot are not important in and of themselves, but their importance lies outside of the content of the concept. We can identify and amplify on what that content might be, but having done that, we haven't actualized it. We haven't enacted it. The enacting comes in that area of experience where we're not dealing with an idea that makes sense or doesn't make sense. It is what we feel or what we encounter on the deepest sort of level. When Kim was talking about earlier, what do you feel? He's not saying something as I take it, which is a kind of pun. The way I feel about this is that. No, it is actually feeling. We can locate in one's body where one feels fear or love or hope or all of these different aspects of life.
I think Wynn wants to say something.
Oh, Wynn, go ahead. You're on.
Yeah. Sometimes for me, the shadow side of each of these positive qualities is more meaningful in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Because they direct me, they're like a big red flag. And I'm thinking of being impatient in line and feeling in my body that jittery,
you're freezing, Wynn.
Feeling that completely in my body. To me, that's the bearing the burden part. And if I can bear the burden of that impatience and that feeling in my body for a few minutes, I find it slowly, if I'm willing to sit with it, it slowly goes away. The burden drops, and then the positive side of that duality begins to arise. And then rather than looking at the person in front of me, writing the check or whatever, and rolling my eyes and tapping my foot and whatever, I have a completely different response to them and how I interact with them. And that could be for any of them. Deprivation, if I'm feeling like poor pitiful me, things aren't going right, I don't have this, that, and the other, and if I can sit with that feeling long enough without spiraling down and locate it in my body and sit with it, eventually I get to the gratitude part. So
yeah.
So that to me is of great value, the shadow side of each of these. And
yes, I agree. And I want to, if I could take a second, I know we're at the end of our time, so I'll try to make this as quick as possible. I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, Wynn, the idea is that it's not just that we get to live with and we can put up with whatever the burden happens to be. And that because we can put up with it, then we discover the positive stuff.
No,
I think that what it means is that it is in the experience of what we might otherwise call negative, that we discover another set of, if I can put it this way, a set or expression of virtue. This is the idea that the rabbis have of there being the Yetzer Hara, the inclination toward evil or towards negative, and the Yetzer HaTov, the inclination towards the good or the positive. That is to say, it's not just that we put up with the negative, and it's that there is value in the negative in and of itself. And this is what I was referring to, or trying to refer to, in saying that the undoing of the midah, of the qualification, is embedded in the very qualification itself. The value is discovered not only in the positive expression, but in the negative expression. And that's something that I think is hard for us to understand as fully as maybe it would be good for us to do. But meanwhile, it is 1:02 and we need to stop. More's the pity. I wish we could continue a little bit longer, but we will meet again next Friday at noon. Thank you all very much for being present, and I'll see you then. Have a good Shabbat and a good weekend and all that sort of stuff, and take care of yourselves.
Shabbat shalom, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shabbat
Thank you.
shalom. A pleasure. Okay.